Welcome back to the Nobody Oxfordian channel. This time I want to review the Catalogue of Honor and how it relates to Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. On my last video, dealing with 40 and the signature, a Stratfordian pointed out that the Oxford genealogy, located at Folger's library, had Edward as the 16th Earl of Oxford, and it wasn't corrected until after his death in the Catalogue of Honor, published in 1610. And as such, Edward would never have considered himself the 17th Earl, and the coding is incorrect. So I took up the challenge. I looked at the Oxford website, found the documents suggested, and went to work. John Anthony was kind enough to help, doing what the Oxford.com site did not do. We dug a little deeper. So here are the documents in question. The two on the left are the genealogy of the de Vere family by the de Vere family through Edward de Vere, currently housed at the Folger Library. This document is not found at the Folger's website, as it has not been scanned in. These photographs were taken by an employee and are not high def, but ended up on their website. I contacted the library and they confirmed that these photos are genuine and taken by an employee at Folger's library. I asked if higher definition photos were available or if the documents could be scanned in and emailed to me. Higher detail photos do not exist, and once the library is back open from COVID, they will scan in these two pages and send them to me. Better quality images, of course, are important because then we can glean more information from the documents, but there's enough there at this point to make my point. The picture on the right is the cover of the Catalogue of Honor, the other document cited in the Stratfordian's argument. The Catalogue of Honor was written by Robert Glover, who died in 1588. His nephew, Thomas Miles, found the catalogue amongst his possessions and felt it too important not to publish it. He updated the book, and it was published in 1610 by William Jaggard. William and his son Isaac Jaggard published the first folio. So you know where this is headed. In the Catalogue of Honor, under the Robert de Vere, 3rd Earl of Oxford section, it says this: After his death he lieth buried cross-legged in the year of grace 1221, in the 5th year of Henry III, with this epitaph. This epitaph precedes the conception of Edward de Vere, and it says, Sir Robert of Vere, the 1st and 3rd Earl of Oxenford, lieth here. God, if he please, have mercy on his soul. Whoever shall pray for his soul shall obtain a 40 days pardon. This epitaph establishes the knowledge that individuals knew what number Earl or Duke they were. Of course, they were not addressed as 3rd Earl of Oxenford. They would be addressed as the Earl of Oxenford. But this epitaph shows that they would know that they were the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 17th Earl. Now, on a side note, I do believe Alexander Waugh is correct that the cross-legged William Shakespeare monument represents the Cairo symbol. However, Robert III is also cross-legged and may have served as the inspiration, or more simply, a reminder to those that know William Shakespeare is a de Vere. Now we have a physical object, the Epitaph of Robert III, that demonstrates knowledge of numbered nobility. So people knew what number or what place in whatever earlship or dukedom they may be. So here is Robert III, and you can count all the way to Edward, 17. It doesn't matter what mistakes were made in the middle. Edward de Vere knows he is the 17th Earl of Oxford. So we have Robert as the 3rd. Before him was Aubrey the 2nd, who was son of Aubrey the 1st Earl of Oxford. So what's to make of the first two names? Preceding Aubrey I, Earl of Oxford, was his father Aubrey, who was the second High Chamberlain of England under Henry I. So it would be appropriate to list this Aubrey de Vere in the genealogy as the father of the first Earl as well as the second High Chamberlain of England. So the first name is Edgar. He is the grandchild of Edmund Ironsides. He was the Saxon King of England. So he was the first Earl of Oxford at the time of the Norman invasion. He died without a male heir, and so the lineage of Oxford died with him. So the 17 associated with Edward de Vere means the 17th de Vere that was in Oxford, not the 17th total. The hereditary title of Oxford for the de Vere family finished with the 20th Earl of Oxford, Aubrey de Vere, who died in 1703. Approximately 8 years passed, and no one was an Earl of Oxford, until which time Robert Harley was given the Earl of Oxford by Queen Anne in 1711. And he wasn't known as the 21st Earl of Oxford, he was now the first Earl of Oxford for his family, Harley. So 17 simply means in the de Vere family. Doesn't mean 17 total Earl of Oxfords that existed. Notice on the right side, there's capital letters called a true pedigree of, but underneath that is other writing, so the true pedigree was overwritten it. The resolution of this photograph doesn't allow us to peer in and see if there's anything that we can make out from it. We can not also make out what names are listed in the circles underneath it. I have no idea what this remainder of the page says. There is a curious star that is on the Oxford coat of arms, and dangling from it is some object. I have no idea what this means. If somebody out there knows, that would be nice to leave a comment, please. This is the very first page of the Catalogue of Honor. I'm going to take a sidestep with my friends just for a moment. Please bear with me. This is the King James VI and First coat of arms. Notice there is no bookends around the centerpiece. The lion and the unicorn are touching the motto directly. But in the Catalogue of Honor, they inserted these bookends. The lion's face looked like it's out of The Wizard of Oz. But don't you think these bookends make 2 A's or 2 L's or maybe even an E? Remember, this book is dedicated to Robert Cecil, but this is the king's coat of arms. How brazen to interrupt his coat of arms with these bookends. But how bold. 2 A's. Twice 11. Okay, let's start looking. Mr. Edward Oxenford, Mr. 1740. What does this book have to say about you? And if you had watched my last video, you know that I believe that Edward thought of himself as the 40th monarch. So at times I'm going to have a little fun with it. So to remind everybody, the numbers that are associated with this signature are 7 for Edward VII, 17 for the 17th Earl of Oxford, which comes from the 1 and 0 in the middle of the signature plus 7 hash marks, 17, and then 40 for the 40th monarch. That's the 4 dots on top with the M multiplied times the 10 in the center. So 7, 17, and 40. And here is the table of contents. And is it any surprise to anyone that the Earls of Oxford are on page 674, which adds up to 17? Now each catalog is like a chapter. So each chapter is titled A Catalogue of the Earls of Oxford, Cornwall, Lincoln, etc., etc. In the table of contents, page number listed on the left here correlates to the page of that catalog title or start of the chapter. A few exceptions. Oxfords are supposed to start on page 674, but this catalog page is not on page 674. It's on page 673. 674 is actually the first Earl of Oxford, Edgar. But I'm sure that's a coincidence or an error of a lackadaisical typist. It was the 1600s. They weren't as sophisticated as we are. They didn't have computers. These errors happened all the time, right? So let's take a closer look at this table of contents. These are all the chapters that land on the corresponding page as shown on this table of content. So if we look at the Oxford chapter and count that as 1 and count up, we end up on the 17th as being the Prince of Wales. And what is the Prince of Wales? The heir apparent, the next in line for the crown. Must be coincidence. But it's not coincidence, because the publisher left out the chapter on the Dukes of York and the Earls of Cambridge. And the previous owner noticed it, and they put an asterisk, and on the left side they wrote Cambridge. Had they put that in, it would have been 1 to 18 to the Prince of Wales, and it would not have worked, or supported the idea that Edward de Vere thought of himself as the 40th monarch. Now, if you notice, on the right side on the bottom, there are names grouped together. There's 3 of them. And a little above that, there are 2 names with Ibidem next to them. And Ibidem, excuse me if I'm saying it wrong, means in the same place. So those 2 names are not grouped together, but they are in the same place as the name above, which is Winchester. Must be coincidence. So if we start at England and count down, including the groups, so a group of 2 would be 1 count, the group of North and Southampton would be 1 count, and then the final group of 5 would be 1 count, you end up with 39. So that must mean the 40 is debunked. But if you add in the hidden catalog, the Dukes of York, you get 40. The 40th monarch for Edward de Vere is hidden. Only a few people knew about it. The hidden catalog, 40. So how many mislabeled pages do you think there are? 7. Edward the 7th. There are 7 mislabeled pages. And for fun, we're going to go look at each page and see what's in it. Unless, of course, you think that 7 mislabeled pages is just coincidence. I used a red highlight for the Prince of Wales page because it is actually on page 289, but they put down 97. So if you add 9 and 7 together, I think you get 16. Now, is it coincidence that the 16th Earl of Oxford was the father of Edward de Vere, and they put 16 down? And that the monarchs of England start on page 1, so 16 plus 1 is 17? Must be coincidence. Something that's of interest is the Earl of Huntington is on page 807, and if you notice, it's really out of sync for the table of contents. Actually, in the book, it is on page 807, but all the numbers around it vary to low 900s to high 800s. But also, again, the numbers add to 16. The previous owner hand wrote 928, and we'll take a look at that later. And finally, for giggles, I added up all the numbers. The left column adds to 10,900. The right column adds to 13,501. Add those together, and I subtracted 1 for England. Since Edward de Vere did not become the King of England, I subtracted 1, and the total was 24,400. And I have no idea what these numbers mean so far. Except for maybe that 24 is the secret code number for Queen Elizabeth, 40 is Edward de Vere, and perhaps 0 means no one followed them. The first mislabeled page is that of Prince Wales on page 97, but that is incorrect because there are two misplaced pages of the peroration between pages 94 and 95, thus making page 95 the actual page 97. If we count lines, starting at the top at 1 down to 17, John Vere, Earl of Oxford, is listed on the 17th line, and there are 7 characters, including a comma and period, for 7 Edward VII. However, this is John Vere, the 15th Earl of Oxford, so this may be placed just to bring attention to the name John Vere. Don't worry, it gets better. There are 2 actual pages, 97. This is the first, and if we count lines starting at the top at 1, Thomas Seymour is the 29th line, and he too is 7 characters. I believe Thomas Seymour plays an important role in the life of Edward de Vere. He was beheaded for attempting to kidnap Edward VI, while at the same time he was known to have an inappropriate touching or contact with Elizabeth I prior to her being the queen. I know this is the weakest Edward de Vere page, and it happens to start with it. It'll get better. So the fun really begins on the second mislabeled page, Lancaster, page 316. So what are the numbers on the page? The page number 316, added together is 10. 10 is the perfect number according to John Dee. The Prince of Wales, 17 letters. So on this page we have Henry, Edward, Arthur, and Henry again. Was there anything of these names that caught my eye? And the answer is yes, the second Edward. It's spelled E-E-W-A-R-D. E-E-W-A-R-D. So what can that possibly mean? Well, we know E in Latin gematria is 5. So we have 2 E's together, 5 and 5. We know that 5 Roman numeral is V. So now we have 2 V's. And when we add 2 V's together, because each V is in Latin gematria 20, we get 40. It's an interesting typo. So what does this section on Edward of Westminster have to say? Edward, the only son and heir of King Henry VI, born at Westminster the 30th day of October in the 31st year of the reign of his father, was created Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester by authority of Parliament at Westminster the 15th day of March in the 32nd year of the said king his father. This prince was afterwards of such towardness that he became skillful in the knowledge as well of martial affairs as of matters of government and laws of the realm. He was murdered at Tewkesbury. Doesn't this remind you of our friend Edward de Vere? He became skillful in the knowledge of martial affairs as well as matters of government and laws. It's interesting. Another coincidence in this Edward of Westminster section is he was not murdered at Tewkesbury. He was killed in battle. He was, however, murdered in William Shakespeare's play Henry VI. When he died, he was coincidentally age 17. So now we end this paragraph with 17, and we begin it with 40. Such a coincidence. Of note as well is that this section is 7 lines long. So let's have some fun with some crazy Prince Tudor theory. What is special about this Edward of Westminster that our friend Edward Vere may feel connected to? He was the only son and heir of the reigning monarch, and when he died as a Prince of Wales, he died as the last member of the Lancaster line. If Edward believed he was the 40th monarch, his nobility would have come from either Edward VI, Elizabeth Tudor, or Jane Grey. So Edward Vere would have been the sole son and heir, and he would have been the last in the line of the Tudor dynasty. This section starts with Edward, 2 E's for 40, and it is 7 lines long, Edward VII. And it ends with Tewkesbury. That is misspelled. Tewkesbury is spelled with Tewkesbury, but they decided to spell it as Teukesbury. So I wonder why that is. Perhaps it's another typo. Let's look at the Latin gematria of the misspelled word Tewkesbury. I'm going to assign a 0 to the U, since U was not a letter in the Latin alphabet. So we have 19 plus 5 plus 10 plus 5 plus 18 plus 2 plus 17 and plus 22, and that equals 98. Now, as customary, we add numbers together. 9 and 8 equals 17. So we end this phrase with 17 and we started it with 40. Coincidence. So we have these italicized words. The first is Edward, that we know is 40. The next is Henry, and Henry means house ruler or ruler. The next is Wales, and Wales means outsider. The next is Chester, that means camp of soldiers, and in this case I might think that it actually means group of friends. And the last is Tewkesbury, and this is where the line ended, the dynasty ended. So we have our friend Edward, who is a ruler. He is an outsider. He has a group of friends, and he is the last in the line. This must have been coincidence. The Shakespearean plays during their time were a source of history education for those individuals who could not read or were not educated. They would go to the plays and they would be taught history. For that reason, Shakespeare took some liberties with the history. He embellished some things, highlighting certain individuals, giving them more credit or not enough credit. And in one of his plays, he said that the Edward of Westminster was murdered, when in fact he was killed in battle, as I had mentioned before. The last prince to be killed in battle, by the way. And in this description, there's another error. Edward of Westminster wasn't born on the 30th day of October. He was born on the 13th day of October. So why the typo? As I said before, it's customary to add numbers. So 3 plus 0 is 3. In what play was Edward of Westminster murdered? That would be Henry VI. So we have Henry VI, Part 3, and the double E's, 5-5. So Henry VI, Part 3, Act 5, Scene 5. Go look there. So Act 5, Scene 5 starts on page 170, the third part of King Henry VI. So 170, with tradition, add the first two digits, 17 with the last two, in this case 1, so we have 17. Count the number of letters in the title, we have 30. Add 17 and 30 together, you get 47, and 47 is a combination of Edward Vere's number, 40, and Edward the 7th, 7, so 47. So in scene 5, we have enter Edward, Richard, Queen, Clarence, Oxford, and Somerset. Edward is directly over Oxford. Edward Oxford. Do we know that guy? So the character Edward, who happens to be Edward IV, the king at the time, sends Oxford to Hames Castle. Awfully close to Headington Castle, but had the author, who happens to be Edward de Vere, used Headington Castle, he would have given it away. Then the king sends Somerset off with his guilty head. Now who in Edward de Vere's time would Somerset be? The Duke of Somerset that's relevant to Edward de Vere in his time is either Edward or Thomas Seymour. Edward being the first Duke of Somerset, Thomas Seymour being his brother. The character the Queen has two abbreviations for her name that I noticed. The first is the top. It looks like a 2U or 2V, and the bottom, which is more traditional, QU. The top one can be read as 2V, and V being 20, so 2 times 20 is 40, or it could be 2Vs, 20 plus 20 is 40, or it can be 2 plus 2Vs for 40, so 240, and with tradition we would add 24, the two first numbers to the last two numbers, and in this case 1, which is a 0, so 24 plus 0 is 24. 24 is the code number for Queen Elizabeth I. This was her reference number in the correspondence, secret correspondence of King James. 24 also happened to be the last year that Queen Elizabeth was not the monarch, likely her happiest year in her life. So as Somerset is leaving to have his head cut off, our playwright, Edward Vere, writes for what I think is Queen Elizabeth, a subtle little indication of her feelings. So part we sadly in this troublous world, to meet with joy in sweet Jerusalem. And here's where we're having fun with the Prince Tudor theory. Edward de Vere, Shakespeare, the playwright, writes a line here for the Prince of Westminster, who resembles his life. The Prince of Westminster is the last in line of a great dynasty, the Lancasters. Edward de Vere is last in line of the Tudors. The symbolism here of Edward Vere writing these lines for a character named Prince, who goes on to say, I know my duty, you are all undutiful. Lascivious Edward, he may be referring to himself here, because during his life he was lascivious, had a sexual desire. And thou perjured George, and thou misshapen Dicky, which is Richard III, I tell ye all, I am your better, traitors as ye are, and thou usurped my father's right and mine. Just stop and think about this for a moment. The popularity of these plays, the fact that all the nobility, including the monarchs, Queen Elizabeth, King James, watch and love these plays. They are in print. They are circulated. People come to watch them. They're enormously popular. And the playwright, Edward Vere, writes a line as he thinks of himself as the 40th monarch for a character named the Prince, and announces to the world, I am your better, traitors as ye are, traitors as you are, and thou usurped my father's right and mine. I am your better, as you have usurped my right. Amazing. No, wait, not amazing. It's coincidence, I'm sure. Then the prince is stabbed 3 times. Trinity. If you notice that Richard and Clarence, the description is Richard stabs him, Clarence stabs him. But when Edward does it, there is no Edward stabs him. I think this is for symbolism and not getting Edward the writer, playwright, confused with Edward the character here and having something say Edward stabs him when him is the figurative idea of being the Prince of Wales. Then we have a line here from 2U, the Queen. 2U, 40, 24, Queen Elizabeth goes on to say, from the writer's perspective, oh, kill me too. That sounds like what a mother would say. Just witnessing her son get stabbed and murdered, she too wants to die. And the response from Richard is, marry and shall. And he offers to kill her. So if you marry, we shall kill you. And we have the Virgin Queen. So are we having fun yet? Isn't this fun? I'm sure I lost a lot of people along the way who think this is all rubbish, but it's fun to do. It's fun to watch, and it takes a lot of energy and time to put these videos together. So I hope you're enjoying it. And I hope you can leave some comments and some ideas of where to take it next or some things that perhaps I've missed. So in the last slide, I showed you how entered Edward, Richard, Queen, Clarence, Oxford, Somerset, and Edward was above Oxford. Now, the signature on the right, recall that we're looking for numbers 7, 17, and 40. Edward 7th. So if you look back, it says enter Edward, Richard, Queen, Clarence, Oxford, Somerset. 7 words. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 words. And normally, they add in an and at the end of the sentence when there's another noun. So, as you see, enter Edward, Richard, Clarence, and soldiers. But we did not do that on the top. Why? Because it would have been left with 8. Or it's a typo, and it just happened to be a mistake in which we are left with 7. It has no bearing or no correlation with Edward VII at all. Now we have another section in which it says, Edward IV, by the grace of God, King of England and France, and Lord of Ireland. Now, fourth, I'm going to steal this from John Anthony because he used the, and changed an H to an E in his videos for T. So here I would change the H to an E, 40. So Edward the 40, by the grace of God, King of England and France, and Lord of Ireland. So how do we know this is a possibility? Because if you count the words, not starting with soul, because that's italicized, but starting with Edward, you have 17. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Edward the 40th, by the grace of God, King of England and France, and Lord of Ireland. Here's another one. Enter the Queen, young Edward, Somerset, Oxford, and soldiers. So, the first word not italicized is enter. Enter the Queen, young Edward, Somerset, Oxford. Oxford is the 7th word. And if we go in reverse, soldiers is the first word, and Oxford is the 7th. Now we've linked Queen and Oxford together as being the 7th word of the sentence. Edward the 7th. And here's crazy Tudor theory guy again. Enter the King, Warwick, Montague, Clarence, Oxford, and Somerset. So starting with enter, Oxford is the 7th word directly below King, King Oxford. And then if we start at the back, Somerset is the first word, and King ends up being the 7th word. Now we've linked King and Oxford together as the 7th word of this phrase. So in these two examples, we have 2 7s atop of each other, 77, and repeated Latin gematria, that is 4 H's. 4 H's becomes 8888, which becomes 8888, and 88 in repeated gematria is 40. 2 40s. So this is the slide I wanted to get to. This is going to go back over a little more in detail of the introduction of Act 5, Scene 5. Now again, it's on page 170, which is 17, and then Act 5, Scene 5, we can do is 20, 20, 40, so 17, 40 to start the page. Enter Edward, Richard, Queen, Clarence, Oxford, and Somerset. The word enter has an alternative meaning. To play a part. So enter, to play a part. Enter Edward, I think is Edward VI. Enter Richard. Now who during Edward de Vere's time is influential and important? Not sure anyone played a larger role for the good or worse than the Cecils. It happens to be that William Cecil's father is Richard Cecil. Now Richard Cecil was a politician and a court member, and during this time his son was on the rise and would have likely known of Edward de Vere, 1740, and would have likely played a part. Or the author, Edward Vere, is trying to point us in the direction of the Cecils. The Queen, I think that is Queen Elizabeth. Clarence, that is in the play, Clarence is the brother of Richard and Edward. So I think this is a reference to the word brother or the status of a brother. Clarence also means clear one, and the nickname of Clarence is Lars, which means crowned with a laurel. Very interesting here. But I still think it referenced brother. And we have Oxford. Now this could be easily Edward Oxford because it's right below, or most likely referring to John, the 16th Earl of Oxford. He would have had to play a part. And then there is Somerset. Somerset being the first Duke of Somerset during Edward's time, which is either Edward Seymour or Thomas Seymour. I happen to think that it is Thomas Seymour, and that the Clarence reference of brother, because when you look at Somerset, it's going to be the first Duke of Somerset, which was Edward. But then you have Clarence there as a brother, so I think the author here is trying to point you in the direction of the brother of Somerset, which would be Thomas Seymour. So let's count. We have enter Edward. Enter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The first letter of Edward, E, lands on the 6th, Edward the 6th. Enter Edward from E to the end of D is 11. We have two words, enter Edward, for twice 11. Richard starts on the 12th letter, and as we know, 12 is M is mem in Hebrew is 40. And Queen ends on 24, so there are 24 characters to the end of Queen. Again, like I said before, 24 is Queen Elizabeth I's code number, so that would indicate that we are correct and that this is Queen Elizabeth I. Now in the second line, Oxford, including the dots this time, Oxford is 7, and the entire line is 16, which indicates that we are on the right track with Oxford, the 16th Earl. So what is the playwright telling us? These are the players. We have Edward VI, because he was the reigning monarch at the time, brother of Queen Elizabeth. He would have to have known about a Tudor, a potential heir. We have Richard, William Cecil's father. The Cecils knew. We have Queen Elizabeth, she knew. Clarence is a indicator of the brother of Somerset, which is Thomas Seymour. And if you know, Thomas Seymour historically has been known to have inappropriate contact with Queen Elizabeth, and that during his interrogation by William Cecil, the interrogation, 90% of it was scratched out. We have the records today, and most of the wording in there is scratched out heavily, and we don't know what his confession was prior to his execution. This was overseen by William Cecil. And then we have Oxford. John Oxford, the 16th Earl, who suddenly died when Edward de Vere was, I think, 12 years old, would have also played a part. He would have had to been the one accepting of this child that we call Edward Vere. Or this is all coincidence, and it just happened to be that these were arranged in this order with these names, and these individuals are happen to be on the number slots to indicate that we're headed in the right direction. At the conclusion of Act 5, Scene 4, and on page 170, is this exchange. There are 4 characters in this interaction: Oxford, Somerset, Queen, and Prince. I believe the playwright's symbolism is intention for Oxford is to be the 16th Earl of Oxford, Somerset to be Seymour, the Queen to be Elizabeth, again with the 2U. A dozen or so lines before the Queen was talking, and the abbreviation was QU, so I think this 2U is intentional. And then Prince. I believe Prince is the symbol for the 40th monarch. So it begins with Oxford saying, "Women and children of so high a courage, and warriors faint, why it were perpetual shame. O brave young prince, 40, thy famous grandfather doth live again in thee. Long mayst thou live to bear his image and renew his glories. So who would the famous grandfather be? It would be Henry VIII. It appears that the intention of the playwright is to link this prince with Henry VIII. The next line is from Seymour, and it says, "And he that will not fight for such a hope, go," meaning sad, "home to bed, and like the owl by day, if he arise, be mocked and wondered at." And then Queen Elizabeth, "Thanks, gentle Somerset, sweet Oxford, thanks." And the prince, as 40, says, "And take his thanks, that yet hath nothing else," because he was beheaded. So what did the playwright do to indicate that this was the 16th Earl of Oxford? So we go to counting. So if we count Oxford as the first sentence ends with shame, and that's the 16th word. And how do we know that this is dealing with Edward Vere? Because the last word, glories, is the 40th word. So how do we know that Seymour's lines are legit? Well, we start with Psalm, that's the first word, and at the end, at, it's 29. We know 29 is a combination of 17 and 12 is 40, so we have 1740. So what about the Queen and Prince lines? Well, the Queen is 2U, as we've already discussed, that's 40, and it's sitting right above Prince, so I'm going to count these two lines as one and the same. The Queen line is 7 words long, the Prince's line is 10. So when adding those together, of course, we get 17. So this concludes the first table of content page numbering error and all of the 17s and 40s associated with it. So the next misnumbered page is that of the Earl of Norfolk. So looking at the page number 498, it'd be nice to say 9 and 8 are 17. Then you have a 4. So do we have 1740 here? I think that's a big stretch. However, Norfolk, though, during Edward de Vere's time, was beheaded because he was linked as the 40 in the Ridolfi plot. So this is the page of Ralph de Ware. Now in the Doomsday book, it's actually Ralph de Gaulle or Ralph Wader, but the editor here chose to say Ralph de Ware. So this is the page with the description for Ralph de Ware. So let's look for our numbers. Well, the R is 17 in Latin Gematria. The 10 and 70 catches your eye as 17. And on the bottom right corner is the catchword for the next page, M, E-M-M-E, and that is pronounced M, E-M, M, and M, as we know, previously, we've discussed it before, is 40. Now within the body of this paragraph are double V's, and we have 6 of them. So we have 6 double V's. Double V's are 40. 6 times 40 is 240, which can be 24, Queen Elizabeth's code number. Another alternative is there are 6 40s, 64. 8 times 8 is 64. So 2 8s is 88. 88 gives us 4 T's. That's something that John Anthony picked up previously and mentioned in one of his videos. And the final counting that I noticed was on the initial 2 sentences. We have 2 A's for 11, because A is 1 in Latin Gematria, double V for 40, and then the M for 40 underneath. So if you count the title of this page, Ralph de Ware, including the punctuation, you have 12. As we know, 12 represents 40. As very interesting how the publisher spelled where with two V's. Of course, two V's is obvious for us. That's 40, that is Oxford. And then slightly offset to the side with spacing is air, A-E-R. The Latin translation of air is air, A-I-R, which is pronounced like this, E-R, which is similar to the way we pronounce air. So if we think that Oxford was the 40th monarch, the publisher put in code here, double V, air, Oxford, air. But I believe the intention of the author is to use the word heir, E-R, and combine it with the V for Vere. And in doing so, wants the reader to connect Edward de Vere with Ralph de Ware in the story told below. So the author is trying to get the reader to realize the symbolism between Edward de Vere and the character in this story of Ralph de Ware. So the page begins with Ralph de Ware, a Briton, was the first Earl of these East Anglias by gift of William the Conqueror, together with Emma, his wife, that was also his kinswoman. The country of East Angles is now divided into two shires. They are Norfolk and Suffolk, of which Norwich is the head city, by which it happened that some have called him the Earl of East Angles, others of Norfolk, so he was called the Earl of Norfolk, and some called him the Earl of Norwich. And it goes on to say this Ralph was one of them that conspired to expel William the Conqueror out of the land in the year of our Lord 1074, for Ralph had then married the sister of the Earl of Hereford, at whose marriage this conspiracy was plotted. The partakers in this faction were the said Roger, William Fitzbourne, son of the said Earl of Hereford, the king's kinsman, Waithoff, the Earl of Northumberland, the son of Sired, the great Duke of Northumberland, many bishops, abbots, and barons, and with goodly men of wares, all which by Archbishop Lanfranc was quickly made known to the king, being then in Normandy. This plot was first discovered to Lanfranc, that was then the governor of England, by Earl Waithoff. The king, upon his news, made speedy return into England, and apprehending the said Waithoff and Roger his kinsman, put them both into irons and kept them in prison. When Earl Ralph heard this, he was struck into a wondrous great fear, and suddenly left England. But the king besieged his wife and family in her castle so long till her victuals failing, she was forced to yield the castle, first taking oath to forsake England and never to return again. Waithoff that bewrayed the treason was beheaded at Winchester. Ralph, as you have heard, being thus fled, the dignity of the said earldom was bestowed upon Hugh Bigot by King Henry I, son to William the Conqueror. So what do we have so far? Ralph de Ware, otherwise associated in this description as Ralph de Vere, so the author wants us to relate him to Edward de Vere. Ralph was an earl. He was an Earl of Norfolk. This was a conspiracy to overthrow the monarch. Earl Norfolk and Hereford and others were involved. Ralph married a sister of the conspirator. It involved the king's kinsman. It was discovered by Lanfranc. Ralph escaped and left England. There was bishops and abbots and barons involved, along with other goodly men of wares. And finally, Waithoff revealed the treason, and as such was beheaded. So what are the similarities between this page's description and the Rodolphi plot? The publisher wants us to link Edward de Vere to Ralph de Ware or de Vere. Both are earls. Ralph de Vere is known as the Earl of Norfolk, and Edward de Vere is the cousin of the Earl of Norfolk. Edward de Vere is known to use the moniker of 40, and in the Ridolfi plot, someone using the code 40 was to marry the Queen of Scots, and history tells us that was the Earl of Norfolk. This page describes a conspiracy to overthrow a king, while the Ridolfi plot was a conspiracy to overthrow a queen. On this descriptive page, they talk about an Earl of Norfolk and an Earl of Hereford as the conspirators with others, and the Ridolfi plot has an Earl of Norfolk, and it may have an Earl of Hereford, we'll talk about later. Rolf de Ware was married to a sister of the conspirator, whereas Edward de Vere was married to a sister of Robert Cecil, but he was too young to be involved with the Ridolfi plot at that time. However, his father, William Cecil, was intimately involved and spearheaded the investigation that revealed the conspirators and the details of the plot. This description describes how the king's kinsmen were involved, and on the Ridolfi plot, it was the queen's kinsman, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was involved. In this description of Raff's conspiracy, it reports that it was discovered by Lanfranc. Lanfranc was the archbishop. However, on the 17th line, Lanfranc was then the governor of England. Now, in the Ridolfi plot, the governor of England at the time was William Cecil, and he was the one who discovered the plot, the conspiracy. Rolf de Ware escaped and left England, whereas Edward de Vere left England a few years after the discovery of the Ridolfi plot in 1575. This page describes the involvement of bishops, abbots, barons, and other goodly men of Wares, whereas the Ridolfi plot involved the ambassador, bishop, 2 dukes, king, and the pope. Waiththeof, who revealed the treason to Lanfranc, was eventually beheaded for his role. In the Ridolfi plot, Charles Bailey was the courier that was captured at Dover with the letters that contained the encryptions. He was under torture, confessed that Norfolk was 40. When they raided Norfolk's home, a decipher was found and Norfolk was arrested, was interrogated, confessed to the plot, and eventually beheaded in April of 1572. Now you may say, well, that's the end of it. Norfolk confessed to the crime. He was 40. However, the problem here is William Cecil was overseeing all of these interrogations and communication to the Queen about who 40 was and Norfolk's plot. Now, you don't become William Cecil in his position of power without seating a cipher at someone's home without them knowing. And it happened to be found under the doormat. So why is William Cecil's involvement suspicious? The Ridolfi plot was discovered or uncovered in April of 1571. It is the exact same time that Edward de Vere expressed an interest in Anne Cecil, and they were married in December of 1571. William Cecil had just become Lord Burleigh as well, and so if you can imagine Edward VII, Edward de Vere, thinking he's the 40th monarch, living under the roof of William Cecil, expresses an interest as the future possible monarch to marry his daughter, and suddenly this plot is uncovered, in which a reference of 40 that everyone knows to be Edward de Vere at the time would place William Cecil in a very difficult position. How could he allow someone living under his roof, under his watch, to be involved in a plot to overthrow the Queen? So it is reasonable to suggest that William Cecil played a role in either protecting Edward de Vere or placing the blame on Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. So how do we know this is talking about or suggestive of Edward de Vere? Well, we have the R in the beginning and then M at the end, but we also have 2 sentences within the body of this paragraph that are in parentheses. If you count from the first line down, 17, you come to the first, which was then governor of England. And if we count from the bottom line up, 17, we come to the second sentence in the parentheses, at whose marriage this conspiracy was plotted. So how do we know that these lines in parentheses are legitimate? If we start counting with A at whose marriage this conspiracy was plotted, A starts with 1. The end of the line of the sentence is conspiracy, the Y is 30, and then we start on the second line, and it ends with was plotted. The dot, which is inside the parentheses, it should be outside, is the 40th character of the sentence. Remember, the Ridolfi plot was uncovered in April of 1571, at which time Edward de Vere expressed an interest in Anne Cecil. They were married in December. It was October of 1571 that the Duke of Norfolk was interrogated and confessed to the crimes, or being part of the conspiracy. So it's reasonable to think that William Cecil had a hand in covering this up, in protecting Edward de Vere, and that at the marriage that the conspiracy was plotted, the author may be referencing that it was the marriage that allowed Edward de Vere to get off and away from the conspiracy. In this line, we count again. T starts with 1, ends with D in England. It's 29, and as we've already shown, it's a combination of 17 and 12, 12 being 40, 1740. And the governor of England at the time of this description, it was Langford, and that is referencing back to William Cecil, who's the governor, or the person essentially running England. And this description refers to an Earl of Hereford, and so was there an Earl of Hereford involved in the Ridolfi plot? We don't know. There's no writings or interrogation of a Hereford. However, there is Walter Devereux. He is the first Earl of Essex and the second Viscount of Hereford, and this is his portrait. And if you notice his hand, it's making a M, what appears to be M, and this was common to do for Mary Magdalene. However, it is also found on the initial engraving or introduction to this book of Catalogue of Honor. So there's a possible link here, and this may be the person that they're referencing, but we have no historical evidence that he was involved. And this painting was done in 1572, shortly after the Ridolfi plot had been ended with the Duke of Norfolk's beheading. Something interesting here is Ralph was married to Julian de Vere, and Julian de Vere was the daughter of Aubrey de Vere II, which is the second person listed on this document that the Stratfordians pointed out as being reason to disclude Edward de Vere from being the 17th Earl. So she is also the brother of Audrey de Vere, the first Earl of Oxford. It's interesting that they would tie this story of Ralph and name him de Ware, actually saying de Vere in the description that we've reviewed previously. So why go through this elaborate hidden description and connection between Ralph de Vere and Edward de Vere and the Ridolfi plot? I think the answer is in the final sentence. It says Ralph, as you have heard, and I think the writer is telling us Ralph, as you have heard, he is Vere in the storyline. Being thus fled, the dignity of the said earldom was bestowed upon Hugh Bigot by King Henry I, son to William the Conqueror. So we look at this sentence and look at the italicized words. Hugh Bigot, in the classic way these individuals during this time coded and got messages across, has the exact number of letters as King James. Henry's meaning is ruler, and William the Conqueror has the exact same letter numbers as Elizabeth, Virgin Queen. So let's read this sentence differently. Vere, being thus fled, the dignity of the said earldom was bestowed upon King James by King Ruler the First, Queen Elizabeth, son to Elizabeth, Virgin Queen. This last sentence seems to add some complexity to the sentence, but if you read it including the last catchword at the bottom, M, remember that's 40, then we have son to Elizabeth, Virgin Queen, 40, which is our guy Edward Vere. But having that catchword there, I'm sure it's coincidence. We know that this sentence applies to Edward de Vere because the first word, Raff, and the last word, conqueror, is 29, 1740. And I believe the message trying to be relayed here is that the Ridolfi plot was why Edward wasn't the heir apparent in the eyes of Queen Elizabeth, and it was passed to King James. Or this can all be coincidence and just a crazy theory. Now for some fun, crazy Prince Tudor theory. This is the Hampden Portrait from the 1560s. It was painted during a time when Queen Elizabeth was under pressure to marry, and so it is thought that this painting was used to display Queen Elizabeth off to potential suitors. If she was being pressured to marry and produce an heir, while at the same time Edward de Vere was her son, and perhaps in this painting she is signaling the 17th Earl. On our left, her right hand, appears that she is making a gesture of 1, 0. Then on her left hand, our right side, there are being shown 4 fingers. And if you count the 3 fingers on the other hand, we have 7 fingers being shown, while her other hand, pinky and thumb, are making a 10. This painting was done when she was still in her 30s, and Edward de Vere was a teenager, and she had hopes and aspirations of seeing him into the monarchy. Still fun and intriguing, though. The next misnumbered page is Cornwall, 552. There are 2 pages labeled 552. The first is Robert of Mortaine, his wife and issue, and the other is Richard Plantagenet. Both pages have obvious 17 references and 40 references for 1740. The Robert of Mortaine page has 17 lines, and it ends with Toulouse. Toulouse happens to be the Catholic stronghold in a Protestant-dominated area during the 1562 to 1598 French Wars of Religion. I think this is implying or suggesting that Edward de Vere and his colleagues were the Catholic stronghold in a Protestant country of England. On the right is the Richard Plantagenet page. It describes a character from 1227. However, in the bottom of the description, there's a misprint. Of course, it's coincidence. Of course, it's April 1572. So what happened on April 1572? Well, the Treaty of Blois was an alliance between England and France, and this kept France from interfering with Mary Queen of Scots. These misprints always seem to be linked to something to do with the monarchy. What else happened in April 1572? Is there anything else happened in that month? The 4th of the 9s is a Roman way of doing the calendar. This can mean either April 1st or April 3rd, but 9s is capitalized here. This is an old French word meaning 9. So what happened on April 9th, 1572? The warrant for the Duke of Norfolk's execution was signed. Interesting finding for a misprint. So if we look at the epitaph, we have R for 17 and 2 V's for 40. If we count out 17 words to Cornwall, the first word after that is he. And if we read this, it says, he was Earl, whose mind did always such contentment as he was never found ambitious. So I think what's being said here is even though Edward de Vere was the 40th monarch, he was not ambitious enough to take on that role. Then after that sentence, there's a colon with a long pause and a parentheses, but that parentheses is not closed, so it draws the attention to the next sentence, which says, but king and kingdoms have this certain fate, implying that people who are in line for the throne may not be ambitious enough to be the king. And if we continue with the repeated count, he is 1, and 17 jumps over to but. And then the king and kingdoms have this certain fate is 7 for Edward VII, one of the numbers. So what in this mislabeled page refers to Edward Vere. If we count Richard as the first word and count 40 words from that, we end on from. And then after that it says, his childhood conceived a singular hope and expectation of him. He became a man of rare wisdom and foresight, on whom such credit and reputation amongst all men. Doesn't that describe the man that we're talking about? We know it refers to him because from his to men is 29. 17 plus 12, 12 is 40, 1740. And now for the fun stuff. This entire page may reference only Richard Plantagena of Eastwell. He died in 1550, and late in his life he claimed to be a son of Richard III. He, like Edward de Vere, who thought he was the 40th monarch, lived with the idea of what could have been. They could have been the monarch, they were illegitimate, and they had to remain in silence. But again, that page may have been mislabeled by coincidence. The next mislabeled page is the Earls of Chester on page 560. Since 1301, the Earl of Chester has been the title given to the Prince of Wales. This mislabeled page must be a coincidence. So if you look at the date 1067, you had 10 to 67 has been the tradition in this book. You get 77. 77 by repeated Latin gematria is 4 H's, or 8888, 2 double 8s, and as we know, 88 is 4T. So we have two 40s, so perhaps two clues to look for. He was one of the first great magnates of Norman
also
England.
known as lupus.
What's interesting is he had 3 illegitimate children, and prior to his death he became a monk and died shortly after. There is the word Edward in this description. On its page, it is the 7th word in. Above it is the Earls of Chester, and below it is the Earls of the Kings. As I had mentioned, the Earls of Chester is the title given to the Prince of Wales, or the heir apparent, and in this case, Earls of Chester, including the parentheses, is 17 characters long. The number of letters between Chester and Edward is 12. 12 is 40. I'm sure these are all coincidences. Below Edward is Earls of the King. Edward de Vere was the Earl King. Counting the lines, starting with the first hue, counting down to 17, we end on the word power. Above that is the singular letter K, abbreviation for king. K in Latin gematria is 10. 10 is Robert Cecil's secret code number. Counting from the last word back, from disorderly, power is the 30th word. 30th is King James's secret code number. So if we read the sentence as the author intended, it reads, 10 had power to reject the king if he did amiss. 10 being Cecil had the power to remove King James if he did amiss. But it's probably coincidence all these things line up. On this page there's also a date misprint. The Earl Hugh died in 1101, not 1103. But if you look closer and count the numbers and the Latin gematria, you come up with a typical number we see everywhere. 1103 is written as 2 I's, and 2 I's in Latin gematria repeated is 32, plus 3 is 35, plus 4 is 39, and then the first is 1, so 39 plus 1 is 40. Had they used the actual date of Hugh's death of 1101, this addition would not come to 40. If we go back and revisit the Earls of Chester with the parentheses of 17 characters, including the parentheses, if we start at the word at, that is 1, the coronation of the kings of England were wont to bear. Bear is the 12th word, so 12 is M is mem, which is 40. We've discussed this before. We come to Edward. So directly above Edward is the Earls of Chester. Is there a page in this book that deals with Earls of Chester that Edward may be related to or associated with that page? Yes, there is. So within the chapter on the Earls of Chester on page 573 is a small section called the Earls of Chester of the line of the King of England, which happens to be 11 words long, twice 11. On this page, it takes 22 lines to complete all of the information for the Earls of Chester of the line of the Kings of England. 22 lines, twice 11 brethren. Now remember, the Earls of Chester is what's given to the Prince of Wales, and the Prince of Wales is the heir apparent. And remember, this is Edward's signature. He has 40 and 7. Edward the 7th, 40, for the 40th monarch. 7 of those lines begin with the word Edward. Edward the 7th. 7th lines begin with the word Edward. Now the skeptic will say, no, there's 8 Edwards. This Edward is indented and is part of the sentence for Richard II. So the editor had to make a typo to make 7 Edwards. It is Edmund Crouchback, not Edward Crouchback. In fact, the previous owner even noted it. Didn't know why he noted it, probably didn't even realize what was going on, but noted that there was a mistake. Edmund, not Edward, but in order to complete the 7 Edwards, the editor had to change it to Edward. At the bottom of this page are 4 B's and a 2. Throughout the book, there are these notations at the bottom of the page. It starts at the beginning at A, then double A, triple A, 4 A's, then B, double B, triple B, 4 B's. And it's always in alphabetical order. On this page, we have 4 B's with a 2. It just happens to be that 4 B's in repeated Latin gematria is 71. Multiply times 2, get 142. Add those numbers together, you get 7. But you can also look at the B's as individual letters. And in Latin gematria, B is the second letter, 2. So you have 2, 2, 2, 2, 4 2's, which is 8. And then with the 2, it means to have 2 8's, so we end up with 88. And as we've known and said many times, 88 in repeated Latin gematria is 4 T's, 40. So here you go. At the end of this page, you have BBBB2. And we can show that that represents 7 for Edward VII and 40, 40th monarch, which is represented in his signature. So far, it must be coincidence that we have a page for the Earls of Chester of the line of the Kings of England, in which we have Edward 7 times. That includes a typo from Edmund to Edward that ends with 7 and 40. Now let's talk about the intention of the author in this paragraph. He chose to use the writing style of was created, was made, was made, was made, was made, was created, was created, was Earl, was made, and was created. 10 times the author used the word was in a sentence about a Prince of Wales becoming the Earl of Chester. Suddenly, the author decided to drop was when discussing Arthur. It says Arthur made Earl of Chester. And Henry VIII made Earl of Chester. The author chose not to use the word was. So why do we think that is? Well, Arthur was the son of Henry VII and the first Tudor Prince of Wales. So how many words do you think the sentence with Arthur is? 13? 18? No, it's 17. Had they used was, it would have been 18. Now look at the last 2 lines. Henry VIII made Earl of Chester, the 19 Henry VII, Queen Mary, Edward VI, and Elizabeth. Those are 16 words. Starting with Henry, it ends on Elizabeth, the 16th word, which makes 740 BBBB2 Edward Vere the 17th word. But had they used the word was, then they would have been at 18. We cannot look to the contemporaries of Edward de Vere and find coding that supports that he is William Shakespeare, but then ignore the same coding that points to him being Edward VII, the future monarch. But I'm sure everything here is coincidence, so let me point out an additional coincidence act of God. The last sentence is not indented. So we have Henry VIII, who was Earl and Monarch. You have Queen Mary, Monarch. Edward VI, Earl and Monarch. Elizabeth, Monarch. Edward Vere, Earl of Oxford, though. This is the line of succession. It should have been Arthur, who died young. Then it became Henry VIII. Queen Mary, Edward VI, Elizabeth, Edward Vere. So if this page were dealing with William Shakespeare and Edward Vere, we would be screaming up and down, this is proof from contemporaries that Edward Vere was William Shakespeare. But since it's dealing with the succession and Tudors, we brush this aside as coincidence. And for that one person who says, well, there's no 17 in the line, there is. 1, 9, 7. 17. This is a fascinating page that has gone unnoticed for centuries. So do you need more? Well, there's more. So if we count from Queen to Elizabeth, there are 6 words, which means BBBB2, which is 740, is the 7th word. Edward VII. This reads Queen Mary, Edward VI, Elizabeth, Edward VII. The top of this page deals with the wife of John Lescott and ends the chapter on the Earls of Chester. And if we look at the page number 573, add that together, 5 plus 7 plus 3 is 15. Well, that's not a code number, right? So let's read the paragraph. Helen, the daughter of Llewellyn, Prince of North Wales, was wife to this John, Earl of Chester, and was married unto him to put a final end to all enmities between Llewellyn the father and Randall, Earl of Chester, this man's uncle. That uncle looks familiar. She was infamous for plotting to take away the life of her husband, John, by poison. After the death of John, she was again married to Robert de Quincey, younger son of Sire de Quincey, Earl of Winchester, whereupon her father became much discontented. So in this paragraph is a double V, indicating 40 and perhaps a message. So let's start counting. Helen is the first word. If we go out 7, that's of, and of is insignificant. Continue counting to 17. That word is and, followed by was. Doesn't seem significant. Continue to count. We come to 29. Enmities, meaning hostilities. Doesn't seem significant because it's also followed by between. Continue to count. We get to 40. And the next word is uncle. And as I mentioned before, uncle looked very familiar. And it is actually the same typeset and spacing as an uncle used in the folio, in Shakespeare's folio. So uncle is 1. If we continue to count, poison is 17. And the next sentence says, she was infamous for plotting to take away the life of her husband, John, by poison. So which Shakespeare play deals with somebody dying by poison? And that is in Hamlet. And in Hamlet, in Act 1, Scene 5, so remember the numbers, 5, 7, 3 equals 15. Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 5, at which Hamlet, and people think Hamlet is an autobiography of Edward de Vere, is visited by his father as a ghost, describing how he was poisoned. And Hamlet's response is, "O my prophetic soul, mine uncle." So if Hamlet is Edward de Vere and his father was poisoned, who is the father figure in Edward Vere's life? That is John de Vere. So in Hamlet, his father's ghost says, "The serpent that did sting my father's life now wears his crown." And Hamlet goes on to say, "Mine uncle." So if Edward de Vere believed himself to be the 40th monarch and a Tudor, who was his uncle? Are we talking about Edward VI? Was Edward VI responsible for the poisoning of John Oxford, the father figure for Edward de Vere. So the next line starts with after, which is the first word, and ends with discontent, the 29th word. 29, we know, is a combination of 17 and 12, 12 being 40, 1740. What does this sentence say? After the death of John, she was again married to Robert de Quincey. Soon we know that John Oxford's wife, Mary Golding, was remarried. Goes on to say, younger son of Sire de Quincey, Earl of Winchester, whereupon her father became much discontented. The Sire de Quincey looks familiar as the A-E-R, heir, we've discussed before. De is of, and Quincy. Now notice the Quincy, the Q-U, is almost identical to the Q-U used in Henry VI, Part 3, abbreviation for Queen. So if we read this, as I think we should for the editor, heir of Queen. And the next few words say Earl of 40. And if you want to get specific, Winchester is double V 40 in Chester. Chester being the Earl of Chester, the Prince of Wales. So we have a double V underneath QU, underneath John. If you notice, the double V is italicized. So if we follow the line, it goes from 40 to Queen to John up to 7, Edward the Seventh. So the final 7th mislabeled page is that of the Earls of Richmond. The previous owner was kind enough to notice this and write a 5 and scratch out the 4. If you notice, the 88 is superset above the 4, setting it off on its own to represent 40 or 40. So there should be one clue on this page. So if we count from the first word at the bottom, Constance up 17, we come to a sentence. By his charter in these words, I, William, surnamed. We again do the counting. By is the first word. The 7th word is I. And we start with I. I, William, surnamed Bastard, King of England. So how do we know this refers to Edward Vere? We count. Now keep in mind, William, anytime William Shakespeare is mentioned, it is always a double V. So we will count all letters, parentheses and dashes, including 2 V's for William, and we come up with 40. Again, not 39, not 41, 40. I, William, surname Bastard King of England. On a mislabeled page, 488, double 8s, 4 T's, 40. 7 words in on the 17th line. Coincidences, misprints, bull. The 7th and final mislabeled page is the Earl of Oxford, page number 674. So if we add these digits together, we get 17. But if we add them as we have been in the rest of the book, the first 2 digits plus the second 2 digits, we get 80. 80 in repeated Latin gematria is 4 11s, 11, 11, and that is double 11, the twice brethren that John Anthony has been working on. And the name Edgar in Latin gematria adds up to 34, which is in repeated gematria 2 11s as well, twice 11. We also have the number 1067, and as before I showed, that was 10 plus 67 is 77. Repeated Latin gematria is 4 H's. 4 H's is 8888. That's 2 88s. 88 in repeated gematria is 4 T's. Again, 40. 2 40s. So what is it about Edward Atheling that's important to the story of Edward de Vere? First, Edgar means spear. Adelring means prince heir apparent. So even his name, Spear, William Shakespeare, and prince heir apparent is consistent with the Edward de Vere that we now know. Spear, prince heir apparent. Edgar's father, Edmund the Exile, but in this case, for this description, they used the word outlaw, died in 1057, when Edgar was a child and he was thought to be about 5 years old, similar to Edward de Vere's story. When King Edward the Confessor died in 1066 without a son or heir, Edgar was the next in line. Edgar, being Spear, prince heir apparent, was the next in line, but he was unprepared. So King Harold was elected, and he bestowed upon Edgar, Spear, prince heir, the Earl of Oxford. A similar storyline if you believe that Edward de Vere was the 40th monarch. In 1066, King Harold died at the Battle of Hastings. Some of the Anglo-Saxon noblemen thought to make Edgar the king, but King Harold made no effort to strengthen Edward's position as future king. It's a very similar storyline if you believe that Edward de Vere was the 40th monarch. As you can see on this roll diagram of Edward the Exile, he was known as Edward the Exile, although in the manuscript here, they used or chose to use Edward the Outlaw. The word outlaw historically meant to deprive someone of the benefit and protection of the law. So the writer-editor chose a different word located directly above King of England. And we know this to be related to Edward of Oxford because the E of England and the O of Norman are lined up. E.O., Earl of Oxford. In addition, Edgar Atheling was the last male member of the royal house of Surgic of Wessex. He was the only surviving male member of the royal dynasty apart from the king. We have one additional capital E over O, and we know this is intentional because of the spacing between Saxon and kings is elongated to align that O directly under the E. It goes on to say Earl Edgar, also can be read as Earl Spear, died without issue, by which means the noble issue male of the Saxon kings did end. If you believe Henry de Vere is not the child of Edward de Vere, but Southampton, then a reference that Edward de Vere died without issue would not be surprising. If you believe Edward de Vere is William Shakespeare, then a reference of an Earl Spear would not be surprising. And if we are to believe that Edward de Vere was the 40th monarch, then a reference that the noble line ended with his death would not be surprising. So this page uses coding 17 and 40, and then uses an opportunity to compare Edward de Vere's life, in which both fathers died at a young age. Both were in line for the monarchy, but unprepared, so someone else was chosen, and both were the end of their line. Edward the end of the Tudor line. But we haven't counted any lines. If we start at the bottom and count up 17, we have a line with Edward. If we count top to the bottom, we have a sentence that says, without issue, the inheritance of the kingdom did. Inheritance is located directly under Edward. This seems to be the theme of this paragraph. So let's take Edward, the only italicized word in that line, and add it to the beginning of the word underneath. Edward, the inheritance of the kingdom did, continues on to say rightly belong unto this Edgar. And again, Edgar means spear. So the full sentence is, Edward, the inheritance of the kingdom, did rightly belong unto this spear. Shakespeare. And of course, all of this equals 12 words, 40. Everyone in this book is listed on the page that describes them, but they're also listed on someone's page about being an issue or born of. So I wanted to go back and look at the page of issue for Edward Atheling. And it is on page 33. And if we count 17 lines from the top of the paragraph, we come to Earl of Oxford. If we count 7 from the bottom, we come to the same Earl of Oxford. And directly above that is heir apparent. those sentences say Edgar, surname Etheling, heir apparent to the kingdom, born in Hungary, Earl of Oxford in the time of the Norman conquest, of whom you shall read more among the Earls of Oxford. So if we count words here, Edgar is the first, Earl ends on 12. However, if we skip the words within the commas, so we skip surname Etheling and born in Hungary, Earl is the 7th. So I think the editor is telling us to read this without the commas. We would read it as Edgar, heir apparent to the kingdom, Earl of Oxford. Or Spear, heir apparent to the kingdom, Earl of Oxford. Or it's a coincidence. The last page I want to quickly discuss is that of Huntington. Although it is not one of the 7 misnumbered pages, its page number is out of sequence with Nottingham and Lincoln. The previous owner was kind enough to write page 928, which is the 4th creation of Huntington during the Tudor reign. The numbers on this page, 1529, if we add those numbers together, we get 17. On this page, we have 2 Edwards on the same line. If we are to count words, the first Edward is word 1, and the last Edward is word 7. The second word, Edward, is directly under the hyphenated word Robert, but Row is the 17th letter in the Greek alphabet. So directly under Edward, we have 17. There's a slight spacing between was and the, which draws your eyes to the son of Edward. And using Row, we have Edward, heir of Row. So who would be the son of Edward, who is the heir of 17, named Edward? It would be this man, Edward de Vere, the son of Edward de Vere and Valvassor, an illegitimate child of Edward de Vere, so happened named Edward. I obtained this photograph from the Marchioness Townsend Allison. I had inquired about the original portrait, which apparently was sold in 1903 by Christie's Auctions House. Searching her files, she found this photograph, but has no record of who purchased the portrait. So if any viewers know who holds this current portrait, please reach out to me so I can forward that information to her. So let's have a little fun with this. As he's standing, you see a V in the sling. At first I thought maybe there should be 2 V's for Edward de Vere, but this is Edward de Vere, his son, so perhaps the V stands for veritas, meaning truth. Then his right arm, our left side, forms a 4, and his left arm is straight out, forming a 1. So do we have 41 here? The doublet that he is wearing looks awfully familiar to the one his father wore. Perhaps it was a hand-me-down, or they only had one style back then. Above the first Edward is the phrase Conception of the Virgin Mary. The symbolic imagery of the Virgin Mary was used to describe Queen Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen. So I believe that the editor is linking Edward and the conception of the Virgin Queen, he being her son. And I believe this goes hand in hand with what we're seeing on the right side of the page about the son of Edward, Edward heir of Rowe. So if we take a closer look at 41's face, he looks awfully similar to his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth. But I'm sure critics would say the artists back then all had one style and people looked similar to each other in portraits. So let's recap all of these mislabeled pages. The Wales page introduces 2 other people contemporaries may not be aware, that is John de Vere and Thomas Seymour. The Lancaster page tells us about the players, those that would have known, and that is Elizabeth, John Oxford, Edward VI, Thomas Seymour, Cecil, and someone named Clarence. The Norfolk page tells us about the Ridolfi plot, and perhaps this is the reason Elizabeth did not push or prepare Edward to be heir apparent. The Cornwall page tells us that Edward, at an early age, was a singular hope and expectation, perhaps to continue the Tudor male line, but he lacked the ambition to do so. The Chester pages tell us that Robert Cecil had the power to name the next king, and of course he chose James VI of Scotland. The Richmond page links William Shakespeare and the bastard king. And the Oxford page reminds us that De Vere was the last in the Tudor line. The Huntington page, although it is not mislabeled, is out of sequence and is the page that tells us the heir to Edward was his son Edward, and he was an illegitimate like his father. It is ironic that all of these mislabeled pages correspond to information given to us about Edward Vere that is also chronological. But I'm sure that's all coincidence as well. The next video is going to deal with just the Oxford chapter itself. Thank you for watching.